Hi, everybody. So in this presentation, we are going to be doing an introduction to myth. I'm going to take you through some of the basic core principles that we're going to be returning to throughout the semester, just kind of starting with laying that groundwork foundation, part of which is defining what myth is, why myth is important, why we study it. I call this slide brainstorming some myths about myths because there are some preconceived notions that we often bring to a course like this um, that are not true about the study of mythology. You know, oftentimes there's this misconception that a myth is just it's a lie. It's something made up. It's just an old story that's not true, and that's the belief about myth that I want you to discard of, at least for the duration of the time that you're in this class. Because what we're going to learn is that even though these stories may be embellished, they certainly may have fantastical elements, but there's almost always a seed of truth in these stories. And from these stories, we learn things that definitely are true about the cultures that they come from. So the next slide should give you some examples of that. Let's see if I can get it to move over. So, as I said here, a myth is a story that reveals basic truths about a culture or civilization. Through a culture's stories, we learn, for example, what they value, what they fear, what they aspire to, what they believe, and also how they view themselves, their environment, their place in the world. And another way to think about that is thinking about the stories of the Holy Bible. If you've looked at the course syllabus, you know that we have selections from the Holy Bible on our syllabus. The reason we do that is because, again, these stories form the foundation of our cultural beliefs. So, in that context, these stories from the Bible, even though for many people they form the foundation of their faith, but we are also looking at these stories as literature, and we're looking at how these stories fit those basic characteristics of mythology. What do we learn about ourselves, about our beliefs? We certainly learn where a lot of our beliefs about who we are, what we aspire to be, etc., that definitely comes to us from that study of the Bible. How did myths originate? People have always been storytellers. That's been true ever since the beginning of time, even long before we had, any technology, movies, film, television, books, even there were stories. There has always been a basic need within humans for story. Story helps us to understand our place in the world. It helps us to understand things that occur in the world, natural phenomenon. People made up stories to explain, you know, why does this happen? Why is the sky blue? Why do we have fall and then summer? Why do we have oceans? Why everything? And stories oftentimes were designed to answer those questions. Myths were passed down first through oral tradition, and this is true of every culture. All right, I often hear my students in this class, they'll come back about mid-semester and say things like, oh, the Europeans wrote all their stories down. Not true, not true. All cultures begin with this oral tradition. It's only as we move into the later centuries of the BC period that we start to get any form of written language. The tablet that you see here, that is from the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's one of the early tablets that were discovered with that epic on there, which those were not, that they disappeared for several thousand years and they were only rediscovered in the mid-19th century. So there's a whole interesting history there about the Epic of Gilgamesh and what happened there, which we'll talk about later as we get into that story. But we're going to define several terms here. One of those we're going to start with is what is an epic, because many of the first stories that we're going to look at in this course are epics. So an epic is a long narrative tale written in poetic elevated language that recounts the journey or adventures of a hero. And of course, we call this the epic hero. In traditional epics, the hero's journey is directly tied to the history of the nation or culture he represents. You might recognize the image here. That is the Trojan horse, and that is from, well, it actually comes to us from two sources. One is the Iliad by Homer, but the other is the Aeneid by the poet Virgil, which is the work that we're going to look at in this course. And the Aeneid is actually the work where we get the detailed version of what happened at the gates of Troy when they let the Trojan horse in. But it's one of those examples of how myth has embedded itself into our cultural consciousness. Hence, we get things like the little cartoon here on the right, which shows Trump, or the head of Trump, as the Trojan horse, right? That this cartoon goes back to the election in 2016, when Trump was elected the first time. And I think this is from the New York Times. I'm not 100% sure about that. But it was depicting, in the same way that the Trojans unbeknowingly let the enemy into their gates. They were trying to make a statement about, oh, we have let the Trojan horse in, and when the soldiers come out of the belly of the horse, instead of Greek soldiers, it's going to be Russian soldiers, and they're going to overtake us, etc., etc., etc. I don't think it quite happened that way, but that's what they were predicting was going to happen. And they were using the Trojan horse to make that example, because again, it's a myth that speaks to our collective consciousness, right? And we're going to encounter quite a few examples like that as we move through the semester. So what is the hero's journey, or sometimes called the heroic journey? It is a type of myth in which an epic hero undergoes a series of trials and obstacles in order to obtain a specific goal. Now, the hero's journey can be external, and an example of that would be, in other words, the reason that the journey must take place is because there's some real physical imminent threat. So this is where we get the slaying the dragon stories, right? Which the slaying the dragon is often a metaphor as well, but in many of the stories, the dragon is a very real threat, right? Vanquishing an enemy or a force that stands as a threat to the safety of himself, his family, or his people. Beowulf operates on that principle. Beowulf must go forth and slay Grendel's mother at the bottom of the sea, in order to protect his community. And this is where we get the quest, right? The idea of obtaining something, some desirable object that can be obtained as a result of the journey. So a great example of that would be the King Arthur tales, the Holy Grail. there's actually something that they hope to obtain through that journey. And that can, of course, can also be anything that would bring good luck, health, happiness, prosperity, whatever that journey might be, whatever they are seeking. But it can also be an internal journey, and most heroes' journey stories are concerned with both the outer and the inner journey. Usually the hero is undergoing both, because not only is there something physical to be obtained from that journey, but there's some change that must come from within. So it might be overcoming some moral weakness, fear, inhibition, some physical shortcoming in order to accomplish this feat. Such as is the case with Gilgamesh, our first story that we'll look at. He may have to learn lessons in basic human values, such as love, friendship, extending kindness or generosity, or learning humility. But we'll see some variants of that with all the hero's journey stories that we'll look at. I am going to close the recording right here because I'm looking at my timer and it's going to cut me off very shortly. So I'm going to go ahead and load this video up, and then I'm going to record the second part of this, which will probably not be very long at all because I've just got a few more points left to cover. But I'm going to go ahead and end this one right now, and there will be a second video that will be loaded. So I will see you all in part 2.